Get ready to dive into one of the most controversial and haunting stories in the Bible, a tale of destruction, sin, and a cursed fate that echoed for generations. What happens when morality collapses and unthinkable decisions shape the future? The story of Lot's daughters and the destiny they chose for themselves is a brutal example of how the past never truly disappears. It shapes everything that follows. Imagine a world reduced to ashes, a family running for their lives, and an impossible choice that would change everything. Sodom and Gomorrah, cities of wealth and luxury, were wiped off the map by divine fury. But what happened next? How did two women, raised in an environment of chaos and moral decay, make a decision that would alter history forever? You may think you know this story, but trust me, there are layers here that few ever explore. What if I told you that Sodom's sin did not die with the city, that it survived in the hearts of those who lived there, shaping their actions long after the destruction? This is not just a story of divine judgment, but a lesson on how wrong choices can define entire destinies. The plan devised by Lot's daughters was not just an act of desperation. It was a reflection of the corrupt environment they grew up in. And the cost of that plan? It wasn't just paid by them, it would affect generations to come. If you think this is just an ancient story, think again. How many times do people make decisions out of fear? How often do they justify their mistakes, believing there is no other way out? How many today repeat the same patterns of a corrupted past, not realizing they are building their own ruin? This is not just a biblical narrative, it is a timeless warning. Was Lot's daughter's story an isolated event, or part of a cycle that continues to repeat itself in humanity? To what extent do our choices today shape our future and the future of those who come after us? If this story seems extreme, it's because its lesson needs to be strong enough to wake us up. But is there still a way to break this cycle? Before we continue, if you like our videos and feel that they have blessed your life, like and comment, even if it's just an amen. This makes a huge difference for this content to reach more people and impact lives. If you are not yet subscribed, take the opportunity to subscribe, activate notifications, and share with those you love. Help spread this message of faith and hope. Each like, comment, and share strengthens this work, which we do with all affection to edify your life. Together, we can reach even more hearts. Continuing. Sodom and Gomorrah were prosperous, vibrant cities strategically located. The bustling streets reflected the brilliance of trade, and wealth seemed endless. But behind the ostentation lurked something dark. A society steeped in sin, where morality no longer had a place. The relentless pursuit of pleasure, power, and excess took over everything. Laws were ignored, compassion became rare, and greed dictated the fate of everyone. The city that had once been prosperous became a symbol of human corruption, a place where sin was not just tolerated, but celebrated. History teaches us that Sodom's decline did not happen overnight. Small compromises were made, values were gradually distorted, until evil became the norm. A man seeking justice in Sodom would feel like a fish out of water, because in that place, right and wrong had lost all distinction. Isn't it curious how history repeats itself? In any era or society where immorality takes root unchecked, destruction soon follows. And Sodom was about to experience the full force of that consequence. Then, judgment came. God, who had endured the offenses of that land for so long, delivered his verdict. The divine plan for destruction was relentless. Fire and brimstone would rain from the heavens, consuming every building, every trace of the city that had become a living testament to human wickedness. Imagine the scene. An eerie silence in the air, the sky darkening supernaturally, and then, without warning, flames engulfing everything. It was the end of an era, a tragic fate that sealed the history of a people who had chosen to ignore the warnings. But do not think this was an arbitrary decision. The sin of Sodom was so profound that even the intercession of a righteous man like Abraham could not overturn the verdict. God had given chances, sent messengers, and warned of the imminent destruction. But how many truly wanted to listen? The same happens today. How many people receive warnings about their path and still insist on making the wrong choices? How many opportunities are wasted before the final fall? Sodom had its chances, but it ignored them and paid the ultimate price. The first flames began consuming the city's structures, and panic took hold of the inhabitants. Gold and riches accumulated with so much effort now had no value. What good was luxury when life itself was at stake? The fire did not discriminate between the rich and the poor, the powerful and the unknown. Destruction was absolute. The man who had spent his entire life building his house in Sodom now saw only ruins around him. And in this chaotic scene, only one man and his family had the chance to escape. Lot, Abraham's nephew, received a clear command: flee and do not look back. His family had an opportunity that no other resident had, the chance to escape the fate that would consume the city. But who guarantees that leaving Sodom behind would be so easy? When one is accustomed to the comforts of a place, even if corrupt, leaving can seem impossible. Who hasn't hesitated when abandoning something that no longer serves them, but still feels familiar? And this hesitation would cost one of them dearly. In the middle of the escape, one last glance back changed everything. Lot's wife, unable to emotionally detach from her past, disobeyed the divine order and was turned into a pillar of salt. How many people do the same? They try to move forward but remain attached to what no longer belongs in their lives. The destruction of Sodom was swift and brutal, but its lessons have endured through the centuries. After everything is consumed, what truly remains? Lot and his daughters had escaped, but now they faced a new challenge: surviving away from the city they once called home. Chaos had already taken over Sodom when Lot received the undeniable command: flee and do not look back. The angels who warned him left no room for negotiation. The city's fate was sealed, and he and his family had to escape while there was still time. Imagine the desperation, leaving behind everything they knew, their memories, their possessions, their sense of stability. But there was no choice. The sin that had consumed that land now demanded its price, and the only option was to move forward without hesitation. The clock was ticking, and every second spent in the city reduced their chances of survival. But escaping is not just a physical act, it is also a mental battle. Lot hesitated before acting, struggling against the urgency of the moment. It's not hard to imagine his mind torn between the safety of his home and the terrifying reality of divine judgment. Isn't this how many people behave? They know they need to leave a destructive situation, but delay, make excuses, and cling to a false sense of control. Only when the angels literally grabbed Lot and his family by the hands and pushed them out did they finally grasp the severity of the moment. Sometimes life has to push us before we make the right decision. The city's streets were no longer safe. The sky was growing unnaturally dark, and an eerie tension filled the air. The cries of the doomed citizens echoed as Lot's family rushed away, uncertain of what lay ahead. What would you do in that situation? Would you run without looking back, or hesitate, trying to absorb everything you were leaving behind? Their dilemma was real. Moving forward meant letting go of everything familiar, but returning was not an option. Their fate was sealed. And then it happened. Lot's wife, caught between nostalgia and disbelief, broke the only rule she was given. She looked back, Maybe it was out of longing, maybe attachment to the past, or even a final attempt to say goodbye to what she was leaving behind. But that simple action had immediate consequences. In an instant, her body underwent a cruel transformation. She became a pillar of salt, a permanent symbol of how refusing to let go of what no longer serves us can paralyze us forever. How often do people do the same? They know they need to move forward, but remain trapped in the past, feeding resentment and holding on to situations and people that no longer make sense. The problem is, by insisting on what is gone, they miss the chance to embrace what lies ahead. Lot's wife became a physical testimony of what happens when the desire to maintain the past overcomes the need to reinvent oneself. And the worst part, her decision was irreversible. Lot and his daughters, now alone, had to keep moving, carrying the weight of their loss. There was no time to mourn. The destruction behind them was advancing fast, and each step taken too slowly could cost them their lives. Fire had already consumed the city, turning the landscape into a true hell on earth. The smell of destruction lingered in the air as the certainty that nothing would remain of that place propelled them forward without stopping. But now what? The city they had left behind was all they had ever known. With no clear destination, they found themselves in the unknown. Their last ties to civilization had been severed, and now they had to find a new place to call home. The fear of what lay ahead weighed heavily on them, as they knew the memories of the past would not fade so easily. But fate was pushing them forward, and with the weight of their loss still on their shoulders, Lot made a decision to isolate himself completely and seek refuge in the mountains, where he and his daughters would be safe. Or at least, that's what he thought. The silence of the mountains was a stark contrast to the chaos they had left behind. The fire and destruction were in the past, but the weight of loss remained. Lot and his daughters were alive, but now what? The city they once called home no longer existed, and the solitude of the caves felt more like a prison than a refuge. Their destiny had been forcibly ripped away, and now they were without direction, without a community, without purpose. The isolation they had sought for safety quickly became a curse. No resources, no companionship, and the constant fear that divine judgment was not yet over. The mountains were supposed to be a new beginning, but they soon became a constant reminder of everything they had lost. No more neighbors, no more celebrations, no marketplace, not even a place to rebuild a life. The sin of Sodom no longer surrounded them physically, but the influence of that world still weighed heavily on their minds. It was as if the destruction had remained behind, but not within them. After all, how does one escape something that has shaped their way of thinking for so long? The solitude not only isolated them from the outside world, but also forced them to confront their own shadows. And it is precisely in solitude that the human mind can play tricks. With no one around, only the echoes of their own thoughts, Lot's daughters began to nurture a dangerous idea. The city was gone, their friends too, and it seemed as if destruction had consumed everything. How could they continue their father's lineage if no one else existed? The fear that they were the last survivors of divine destruction turned into an obsession, and the more they thought about it, the more convinced they became that they needed to act. Desperation can lead anyone to make unthinkable choices. In a world where rules no longer existed and morality seemed like a matter of survival, a plan began to take shape. The plan. Lot's daughters no longer saw their father as just a figure of authority, but as the only means of securing a future. Their distorted logic solidified, and the fear of being the last remnants of a ruined world overshadowed any moral hesitation they may have had. It's fascinating how the human mind can justify things that, under different circumstances, would be unthinkable. In moments of desperation, the line between right and wrong can appear much thinner than it truly is. Lot's daughters' isolation was not just physical, but psychological. With no one around to offer a different perspective, without a community to challenge their beliefs, their ideas became absolute truths. And when no one is there to question a decision, the illusion that it is right becomes even stronger. Perhaps if there had been someone to advise them, someone to offer a different solution, this story would have had a different outcome. But there wasn't. There were no mentors, no guides, no one to prevent such a sinister plan from taking place. Their fate was sealed, not by divine judgment, but by the very choices they were about to make. They saw no other alternative. And when the mind convinces itself of something, it becomes nearly impossible to see beyond its own perspective. The sin of Sodom was not destroyed along with the city. It survived in the mentality of those who had grown up within it. And so the plan was set in motion. First, they would ensure that their father was in a state where he could not oppose the plan. Then, one by one, they would carry out what they believed to be their mission. The night would fall over the mountains. But it wasn't just the sky that darkened. Something even more sinister was about to unfold. The silence of the mountains was not enough to erase what Lot's daughters carried within them. Time had passed, the dust of destruction had settled, but a new fear was growing in their hearts. They looked around and saw only solitude. And solitude has a cruel way of distorting reality. The idea that no one else remained in the world took root, becoming an absolute certainty. If they did nothing, their father's lineage would end. And it was in this desperation that a plan began to take shape. A plan that defied any moral principle, yet to them seemed like the only way out. The decision didn't come overnight. At first, it was a whispered thought, an absurd idea that was quickly dismissed. But what if? The question lingered, gnawed at their minds, and each day it seemed less absurd. The environment shapes beliefs, and their environment had been Sodom, a city where the boundaries between right and wrong were so blurred they might as well have been non-existent. Sin does not die with the city. It continues to live in those who were shaped by it. Lot's daughters were not inherently wicked women, but they had been conditioned to think as if they were still surrounded by the same corruption they had witnessed all their lives. The solution seemed simple. Get their father drunk. If he was unaware, there would be no resistance. The plan was drawn up and its execution was meticulously thought out. The first night, the older daughter. The second night, the younger one. The logic was cold and calculated, but to them, it was merely an act of survival. Their lineage depended on it, or at least that's what they convinced themselves to believe. When the mind is set on justifying a mistake, it will always find arguments to make it seem acceptable. And so, the first night arrived. The wine was served. The cup was refilled and emptied multiple times. Lot, unaware, surrendered to the effects of the drink. His eyes grew heavy, his consciousness faded, and then the plan was carried out. The sin was committed. But there was no celebration, no relief. The silence of the mountains felt heavier than ever. The sun rose, and Lot, remembering nothing, went about his routine with no suspicion of what had happened. But for his older daughter, that night had sealed a fate she couldn't yet fully understand. The next night, the plan repeated itself. Another night, more wine, more oblivion. Now both daughters had done the unthinkable. Their fate was written, and their lineage would forever bear the marks of that sin. The act itself was brief, but its consequences would echo for generations. What seemed like an emergency solution turned into an eternal problem. Because every choice has a price, and theirs would be paid throughout history. Lot never knew what had happened. His name was not tainted by this act, but the truth remained hidden only from him. For his daughters, however, reality could not be ignored. What they had done could not be undone, and now they had to deal with the outcome. Soon they realized that what they had created was not just a continuation of their father's lineage, but a curse that would bring conflict, division, and war. Life went on, and their wombs soon brought into the world those who would carry the marks of this distorted plan. Moab and Ben-Ami were born, but not as heirs to a grand destiny. Their stories would forever be tied to the curse of their past, and their descendants would be seen as enemies of God's people. The price of sin is never paid by the guilty alone. It spreads like a shadow, affecting generations. And so, the lineage that was supposed to be a rebirth became an eternal reminder that some choices carry consequences that cannot be undone. Months passed, and the bodies of Lot's daughters began to bear the weight of the consequences of their choices. They were pregnant. The plan had worked. But was this truly what they wanted? Perhaps, in their illusion of ensuring a future, they had not foreseen the impact of their actions. Every movement within their wombs was a silent reminder of a night that could never be undone. And soon, they would realize that this burden was not just physical. Their fate was already sealed, and the price of sin would begin to be paid. The children were born, the first, Moab, the second, Ben-Ami. They were innocent infants, yet the weight of history already followed them. They would not only inherit the blood of their grandfather, but also the stigma of a controversial origin. From birth, they carried an invisible mark, a destiny written before they had even taken their first breath. They were sons of sin, and that past would follow them for generations. Moab and Ben-Ami would grow up and give rise to entire nations, but their roots would never be forgotten. The Moabites and Ammonites became prosperous nations, but they remained far from the covenant with God. They were peoples who, despite being descendants of a righteous man, had been born out of a condemned act. Could anything good come from such a grave mistake? That doubt lingered over their existence, and as time passed, Lot's descendants distanced themselves further from the faith that should have guided them. Their rituals, their beliefs, their way of life, all reflected a lineage that had begun in the wrong way. Their relationship with Israel was marked by conflict, distrust, and disputes. Moab and Ammon did not see the Israelites as brothers, but rather as rivals. And fate wove its irony. The descendants of Lot, who had once been saved from destruction, now became a stumbling block for God's chosen people. Sin had not only stained their origin, it had become a part of their identity. Over the centuries, the Moabites and Ammonites challenged Israel, fought against them, and allied with enemies to weaken them. And the most curious part? Even with such a turbulent beginning, history is never just about curses. Moab's lineage, generations later, would give rise to a woman who changed everything. Ruth, a Moabite, defied fate and became part of the genealogy of King David and eventually of Jesus Christ. This proves that no matter how dark a past may seem, there is always room for redemption. Destiny can be rewritten, but only by those who choose to break the cycle. However, Moab and Ammon's legacy was not only about redemption, it was about the consequences of bad choices. When Lot's daughters devised their plan, they believed they were securing a future, but had they truly done so? Or had they simply prolonged a problem that sooner or later would return to haunt them? History continued, and with it, the echoes of a sin that refused to be forgotten. The Moabites and Ammonites lived, prospered, and waged wars, but their identity was always marked by their origin. The decision of two isolated women in the mountains echoed for centuries, affecting generations. And what had begun as a survival strategy became a living example of how some choices do not just affect those who make them, they shape the fate of nations. The story of Lot did not end there. His descendants would continue to clash with Israel in bloody battles, and the rivalry between these peoples was just beginning. The Moabites and Ammonites grew and multiplied, becoming powerful nations. But do not be deceived. Prosperity does not mean peace. Their ties with Israel were never harmonious. Quite the opposite. They were destined to be adversaries. The fate of these peoples, sealed since their birth, seemed to revolve around conflict. Moab and Ammon were born from sin, and that sin did not just shape their origin. It influenced their future actions. Instead of recognizing their shared lineage with the Israelites, they chose rivalry, jealousy, and confrontation. The first major tension arose during the Israelites' exodus from Egypt. After centuries of slavery, the Hebrews were marching toward the Promised Land, and guess who tried to stop them? The Moabites. Balak, the king of Moab, seeing the growing power of Israel, feared their strength and sought a desperate solution. Instead of seeking an alliance or understanding the divine purpose behind Israel's journey, he hired a pagan prophet named Balaam to curse them. But fate played a trick on him. God transformed every curse Balaam spoke into a blessing. That did not stop Moab from trying other ways to defeat Israel. If they could not defeat them by force, perhaps they could weaken them through sin. Moabite women seduced Israelite men, leading them into idolatry and immorality. The plan worked temporarily. Corruption spread through the Israelite camp, and God's wrath struck them hard, resulting in the death of thousands. This event was clear, proof that Lot's descendants were still deeply influenced by the same sins of Sodom. The Ammonites were no less hostile. Centuries later, when Israel had already become an established nation, it faced bloody wars against Ammon. One of the most striking episodes occurred during the reign of Saul, when the Ammonite king Nahash surrounded the city of Jabesh-Gilead and offered a humiliating proposal. The inhabitants could surrender, but each man would have his right eye gouged out as a sign of submission. It was a direct insult to God's people. Saul, filled with divine fury, gathered an army of 330,000 men and crushed the Ammonites in battle. Conflicts continued over the centuries. Moabites and Ammonites repeatedly attacked Israel, and each confrontation reinforced the curse their origins carried. When David took the throne, he finally delivered a devastating defeat to Moab. But the rivalry never ended. Even Solomon, known for his wisdom, fell into their trap by allowing Moabite and Ammonite women to influence his heart, leading him into idolatry. The sin that had begun in the mountains was now directly affecting the fate of God's people. And it didn't stop there. When the kingdom of Judah was invaded and taken into exile, Moab and Ammon did not help their distant relatives. They celebrated the fall of Jerusalem. The prophets accused them of laughing and rejoicing while the temple was destroyed. This sealed even further the divine judgment against them. Their cursed roots, which had haunted them for generations, now faced their final reckoning. Over time, their kingdoms weakened until they completely disappeared from history. The sin of Sodom did not die with the city. It continued through Lot's descendants, shaping centuries of wars and tragedies. The enmity between these nations was not just a political issue, it was a reflection of what happens when a lineage is born out of sin and does not seek redemption. And the fate of these nations, it had already been written. But before everything came to an end, an unexpected surprise would arise. Now that you know this story in detail, the big question is, what lessons can you take from it? The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, Lot's escape, his daughter's desperate plan, and the cursed fate of their descendants. All of this is not just an ancient account, but a mirror of human reality. How often do impulsive choices based on fear or desperation create consequences that last far beyond what we imagined? Lot wanted a prosperous life, but he ignored the spiritual dangers of where he chose to live. His daughters, lacking a broader, vision of history believed they were saving their lineage, but in reality they were perpetuating a cycle of sin. What does this teach us? That not every opportunity is a blessing, that thoughtless decisions come at a high cost, and that what we try to avoid often finds a way to chase us down. Now ask yourself, are you still holding on to something you should have left behind? Have you been making choices based on what seems convenient without considering the long-term consequences? How many times do we look back, like Lot's wife, trapped in the past, unable to move forward? Life sends us warnings all the time. The question is, are we listening? The truth is, this story is not distant from us. The destiny of every person is shaped by daily choices, by the environments they choose, by the values they embrace or ignore. What happened to Lot and his daughters was not fate. It was the inevitable result of choices made without the right perspective. But here's the good news. If choices can destroy us, they can also save us. There is always another path. The question is, are you willing to take it? If this message resonated with you, don't stop here. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and keep learning with us. Here, the Bible is not just an ancient book. It is a map to understanding life in a real and profound way. Don't repeat the mistakes of the past. Learn from them. The next step is in your hands.